Hi there, welcome. My name is Jason, and what I have to share with you today is how to activate those frozen yeast heart starters that I previously did a video on. It's essentially how to, these have started to melt already, but so this is just a bag of the frozen hearts that I went over in my last video. It's just essentially yeast starter, sourdough yeast starter, frozen into little molds to make little hearts. If you didn't have those, you could also just do ice cubes or yeast cubes. And those, what you can use later on is you can activate those later. So you freeze them to have a backup and or share with family and friends. And then when it's time to activate, well, that's what this video is about. So what I have here is the cubes in here. I've already done this, so I'm just gonna walk you through it. So you take 3 to 5 frozen yeast cubes and you add it to a jar. And I would get a decent sized jar like this, and or larger. And you just add the 3 to 5 yeast cubes. You add half a cup of white flour, it's unbleached white flour, and half a cup of purified water at room temperature or cool. And those are the ingredients. You stir it up and let it sit for a few hours. Never add hot water to this. Only use the cool or room temperature water. Room temperature is best, but just never boiling water. Boiling water will kill the yeast and you won't have any bread. So just so you know that, you have your yeast starter cubes, flour, and water. Equal parts flour and water. So I start, this is a 2-day process. So in the morning of the day that you start, I would do the yeast cubes with the half a cup flour and half a cup purified water. A few hours later, or even that evening, you're going to want to do a 1/4 cup flour and a 1/4 cup purified water. And while this is sitting out, just make sure that you leave the lid like very loosely screwed on so that this activity that's happening with the yeast and the water and the flour, it'll create some gases and you want it to be able to breathe. So have it loosely on there. And or another way that's easier probably, it just depends on whichever way you like, either way works, is you can just put a cloth over the top and then just leave it like that and it'll be breathing just fine. It'll also prevent things from going in there. Fungus gnats sometimes can be attracted to yeast and you just don't want anything going in there, but you do want it to breathe. So the first day, in the morning, you have the yeast, flour, and water. Evening, yeast, flour, and water, let it sit overnight. The next morning, do another 1/4 cup of white flour and purified water, the 1/4 cup of purified water. This are the equal parts. And then that evening on the second night, you're going to want to do that again. That night though, however, you can either, it depends, yeast are all different. Some take like a little bit longer, some are faster. It just depends on the one that you have. I have a sourdough starter and this particular one, that timing works for this one. And so what I do the night of the second evening, it's active and ready to go. You could actually make bread out of it. You're going to want half a cup though for each loaf of bread that you'll see in my next video on how to make your own roll of sourdough bread with a combination of unbleached white flour and whole wheat flour. But for this one, it's just how to activate your starter. And so in the evening on the second night, you just want to screw the lid on tight so that you can put it in the fridge and let it go to let it just hang out there, because until you have enough to use, you don't want it to be at room temperature all the time because the yeast is just going to go through that flour, and you kind of want to stagger it out and make sure that there's always some flour calories that the yeast has access to. When you put this in the fridge, you're kind of slowing everything down. So it's not going to consume all of the gluten or the carbs in the flour. All the activities kind of like at a standstill. So you kind of paused it. And so every time you put it in the fridge, you're pausing it, which is very useful because every time you take it out of the fridge, you're unpausing it. So based on how cold it is, it takes some time to unpause. But yeah, so that's what you're going to want to do. Following the first 2 days where you've actually activated it, it would be more like feeding it equal parts each day after. And you can set a timer like for an hour or two each night that you bring it out and give it equal parts purified water and white flour. I like to use time cubes. These are really fun. I use these in the kitchen all the time. If I just want to do a quick 30 minutes, you just set the cube down with the 30-minute side up and it automatically sets the timer for 30 minutes. There's different time variations around the sides, but this is pretty cool and fun for this. And like I was saying, just use white flour when feeding your yeast starter. When it comes to flour, there's whole wheat flour, there's white flour, there's all kinds of flours. But two of the very popular ones are the white flour and the whole wheat flour. So the whole wheat flour has the germ, the bran, and the endosperm. So it has more fiber, it has all of those components, where the white flour is just the endosperm. And so it's just one element. So it's kind of like, just think along the lines of something that's simple to digest, like baby food. And so you're babying your yeast. And so you're just going to want to feed it the purified water and the white flour, the endosperm, so that it has quick access to those carbs, to the gluten in the flour that's in here. And I highly recommend, especially if you're just starting with making bread, is to use a 12% or more on the protein level. So just look on the package. I like this King Arthur brand, and if you look there, it says 12.7% on the protein. That's perfect. This is a really good white flour to use. You don't have to use this one, but it is a very good one. The protein content is what encourages that chew in your sourdough bread. And so this one, by using this flour, you will get the chew and it'll taste really good. So just keep that in mind. And then, if you have other white flour, that works too. And just know that the chew is influenced by the protein level of your flour. And what I have here is this big jar. I haven't really talked about it yet. This is what I use. So I'm cooking from this like weekly. So once to twice a week. My household, we go through about 1.5 loaves of bread a week. So I'm using this all week. So every time I use it, I take 1/2 cup of starter away, and then I replace equal parts. I feed it back. I feed this again after I take from it. So I'll give it back equal parts, the white flour and purified water. Usually it's 1/4 cup, but it's essentially just to keep it full. So what I'll do is I'll feed it. I'll go start working with my bread. I'll feed this. I'll set it aside. I won't put it right back in the fridge because I want to activate it again. Then I might just do 30 minutes, or I might do an hour or 2 hours. It just depends on how much time I have. But 30 minutes to an hour is typically what I do when I refeed my jar before I put it back in the fridge. And I do that a couple times a week. So each yeast is different, on how much it takes to activate it and keep it going. But 2 to 3 times a week is what works for me in this one. And if you are not using this every week, and say you just have it in the fridge, I would recommend, once a week, taking some of the starter out. You can compost it, throw it in the green bin, and then just putting fresh white flour and purified water into your starter, just to keep it cycling, so that you don't just have really old flour. Because the yeast, even though you pause it in the fridge, it is still active on a certain level, and it will deplete the flour calories, and all the activity that you want, and really active yeast will diminish, and then you'll have to start it over again. I highly recommend, once you've activated your frozen yeast starters, is if you don't have a backup of frozen starters in the freezer, that once you fill the jar, that you do freeze some, just in case your flour were to ever get contaminated. I've never had that happen, but I know that it can happen. So that's just freezing some of it provides you a backup. So just always know that. And yeah, stay tuned for my video on how to make your fresh loaf of sourdough bread with a combination of whole wheat and white flour. So yeah, any questions that you might have on activating your yeast starter that's now melted as the sunset's coming through the window. But yeah, any questions you have on activating your yeast starter that's frozen, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And once again, my name is Jason. Thanks so much for hanging out.